It was a beautiful autumn afternoon in Manhattan, and Darren could feel the city's pulse as he walked down Fifth Avenue. Dressed in a dark wool coat, a navy sweater and jeans, he blended into the cityscape, a casual look that suited his style. He approached a bank entrance, the kind of institution that oozed old-world charm with marble columns and bronze decor, its walls decorated with paintings of past financiers. Inside, chandeliers sparkled above a polished stone floor, and voices echoed in the spacious lobby. Darren glanced at the patrons around him, business executives in tailored suits, an elderly couple with a financial advisor, and a young mother with a toddler in tow. It was the kind of place where appearances meant everything. As he entered, Darren caught a few lingering glances. He was used to it. He'd long stopped expecting that first impressions of him would be favorable, not because of anything he'd done, but because of what he represented in certain people's minds. Darren stood tall, kept his face neutral, and made his way to the teller line, determined not to give any reason for those glances to hold. He was here for a quick visit to finalize details for a business transfer that needed his in-person approval. He reached the counter and smiled briefly at the teller, a young woman with a polite smile. Before he could begin, a sharp voice came from his left.
Can I help you with something?
The tone was almost challenging. Darren turned to find himself face to face with a man in his 40s, sandy-haired and dressed in a bank uniform that seemed almost military in its precision. The nameplate read, Richard Hannigan.
Yes, I just need to confirm some details for a transfer.
Darren replied calmly. He tried to keep his voice steady and professional. This wasn't the first time he'd been treated with suspicion, though he knew he had done nothing to invite it.
What kind of transfer?
Richard asked, his gaze never leaving Darren's face. Darren raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the abruptness.
A corporate transfer. I manage an account here.
Richard nodded, a slight twitch in his jaw. He glanced at the teller, and Darren caught a subtle exchange. He knew that look. It was the look people gave when they thought something was off.
Clearing his throat, Darren presented his ID and account documents. He was used to having to prove himself, even in places where no such proof should be necessary. He'd long since accepted that in settings like these, his resume, his title, and even his business's success would never speak louder than the simple fact of his appearance. Richard took the documents, scrutinizing them with unnecessary intensity. He placed Darren's ID under a scanner, eyes flickering to the screen as if expecting some red flag to pop up.
You work. Where?
Richard asked, his tone skeptical.
Elitech Solutions.
Darren answered, maintaining his calm.
We handle security software for financial institutions. My account details should confirm that.
He noticed Richard's lips press into a thin line, perhaps realizing he was speaking to someone with at least some standing. Richard stepped away, muttering something under his breath. Darren tried to brush it off, his gaze wandering over to the far corner of the bank. In a split second, Richard returned, now joined by a security guard.
Is there a problem?
Darren asked.
We're just verifying,
Richard said with a slight smirk, glancing at the security guard, who moved a step closer, arms crossed. The tension in the room seemed to thicken. Other customers had started to glance over, the air buzzing with whispers and exchanged looks.
Look,
Darren began, his voice laced with frustration.
I'm just here to confirm my account details. If there's an issue with the paperwork, say so. Otherwise, I'd like to proceed.
But it was as if his words were caught in an invisible net. No one was really listening. Richard, the security guard, and even the teller were looking at him as though he were an intruder in their world, someone whose intentions were suspicious. The security guard leaned in, his voice a gravelly whisper.
Sir, we've had cases of identity theft recently. We're just following protocol.
Darren bit back a retort. He knew it wouldn't help his case. He'd seen this kind of protocol before. He knew how easy it was for things to spiral if he lost his temper. So, he stood there, biting back his frustration, his fists tightening at his sides.
I understand security,
Darren replied evenly, keeping his tone steady.
I work in it.
A touch of confusion crossed the guard's face, but it vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a mask of guarded suspicion. Richard held up a hand, signaling for Darren to stay put.
Just a few more moments, sir. Standard protocol.
He repeated, as if to justify the demeaning treatment he was giving. Darren's patience was wearing thin, and his pulse thumped in his ears. The faces around him blurred as he stood there, enduring the humiliation, waiting to be seen not as a threat. Instead, Richard glanced at the security guard and murmured something, and before Darren knew it, he was being escorted away from the teller line and toward a small, windowless office at the back of the bank. His heart pounded as he was led into the room, the sense of isolation and dread growing with every step. Once inside, the security guard shut the door behind him. Darren was left alone. The silence of the room reminded him of past incidents he had tried so hard to forget. It was a familiar sensation, the feeling of being trapped, judged, and unseen. He took a steadying breath, his mind racing with thoughts of his hard-won accomplishments, the years he'd spent building his reputation, his company, his name. And here he was again, reduced to nothing more than a suspect because of the color of his skin. The space was cold and lifeless, stripped of any warmth or color, just a metal desk, a couple of chairs, and a single fluorescent light flickering above him. He took a deep breath and tried to center himself. After a few long minutes, the door opened, and Richard stepped in with a thin folder in his hand. He placed it on the table between them, eyes narrowed in what could only be described as suspicion. Behind him stood Officer Ben Tully, a man whose square jaw and tightly cropped hair added a menacing air to the already tense room.
We'll need a few more details from you.
Richard said, sliding the folder a few inches closer, as if it were some heavy burden.
For verification purposes.
Darren clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully.
I've already provided my ID and account documents. I don't understand what else you need.
Richard leaned back, folding his arms.
There are certain inconsistencies with your account activity that we'd like to clear up.
Darren's eyebrows lifted in disbelief.
Inconsistencies?
His voice was measured but threaded with a rising edge.
I don't have any inconsistencies. Everything is above board. If you check my account history, you'll see regular transactions, payments, and deposits.
The security guard, Officer Tully, interrupted, crossing his arms.
You say that now, but we've seen plenty of cases where people like you claim everything's normal, only for us to uncover something much worse.
People like me?
Darren repeated, a slight tremor of disbelief shaking his voice. Tully didn't blink.
High-end fraud, big names coming in, pretending to be someone they're not. And with a name like Elitech, well, it's convenient, isn't it?
The accusation felt like a punch to the stomach for Darren. He fought the urge to defend himself, to list every accomplishment he'd achieved, every barrier he'd overcome. But he knew it would do no good. They weren't looking to see him for who he really was. They had already made up their minds. He took a slow breath, choosing to speak carefully.
You don't know anything about me or my business.
Richard leaned forward, an almost predatory gleam in his eye.
Then maybe you'd like to explain why a significant transfer from your account was flagged last week?
Flagged?
Darren's tone sharpened.
That was an authorized business transaction. I work in technology. Our transactions are high value because of the services we provide.
Richard rolled his eyes, his face showing he was enjoying the whole situation.
Look,
Darren said, his voice low and controlled.
I don't know what you think you're going to find, but there's nothing suspicious about my account. I run a business, an entirely legitimate business. I have clients, contracts, and payroll. All of it is documented.
Richard smirked as if he found the statement amusing.
A legitimate business?
He repeated, almost mockingly.
Funny, because the last guy who claimed that was in here a few months back, and he turned out to be a scam artist. We take these things very seriously here.
Darren's hands clenched on the edge of the table, his patience slipping.
And you're basing this, what, on my appearance? On your assumptions about me?
The security guard shifted, his expression blank. Richard, however, didn't back down.
Darren leaned forward, meeting Richard's gaze head-on.
You're assuming something about me without any facts. And if you'd actually taken a look at my account history, you'd see that I've been banking here for years, that I run a successful business, and that I have a clean record.
Richard seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, a flicker of doubt passing through his expression. But the security guard, Officer Tully, crossed his arms tighter, unmoved.
You'd be surprised how many people say that.
He muttered, giving Darren a dismissive look.
Doesn't mean we can't check. It's our job.
It took every ounce of control Darren had to sit there to keep his tone measured and calm. He took a steadying breath, calming the storm of emotions he was feeling. He wasn't here to prove his worth to these men. He was here to be treated with the same respect and dignity that anyone else would expect. And he was not going to let them strip him of that.
Look,
He said, his voice rough.
if you're finished with your accusations, I'd like to continue with my business. You can verify anything you want, but I have every right to be here, just like anyone else.
Richard narrowed his eyes, and for a moment, it looked as if he might back down. But Officer Tully leaned in, his voice dripping with suspicion.
We'll decide when we're finished. Not you.
Darren opened his mouth to respond, but just then, the door opened, and a new figure entered. A woman in her 50s with carefully styled hair, sharp eyes, and a commanding presence. Her tailored suit and the air of authority about her were signs that she held a powerful position in the bank.
Is there a problem here?
She asked, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. She glanced at Darren, her eyes narrowing slightly before settling on Richard. Richard straightened, adjusting his tie.
Just following up on a flagged transaction, Ms. Lyons.
He said, with a tone that was more deferential than he'd used with Darren. Ms. Lyons gave him a questioning look before turning to Darren.
Mr. Ellison, I apologize for the inconvenience.
She said, her tone smooth but wary.
I'm Margaret Lyons, the new bank manager. Would you mind explaining the nature of your business here?
Darren met her gaze, his voice firm.
I'm here to finalize a transfer, nothing more. I've already provided my ID, my account details, and frankly, I've been treated with nothing but suspicion since I walked in here.
After a long pause, she said,
If everything checks out, then there should be no reason to continue whatever this is.
Her tone softened, but there was a hint of regret in her eyes, as if she were seeing the situation clearly for the first time. Darren watched her as she slowly realized that he had been singled out of the queue because he was black. It was a judgment, one based on assumptions that had nothing to do with a flagged transaction. Margaret turned back to Richard.
Richard, why don't you finish verifying Mr. Ellison's account details and let him proceed with his transaction?
Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded, giving Darren a curt look.
Thank you.
Darren said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. He met Ms. Lyons' eyes, holding her gaze for a minute longer than necessary, letting her see the hurt, the anger, and the dignity that he refused to let them strip away. Ms. Lyons nodded, a faint shadow of regret passing across her face.
We'll get this sorted out promptly, Mr. Ellison. I apologize again for the inconvenience.
Darren watched as Richard and the security guard left the room. He knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But for now, he would play their game because he knew that eventually the truth would come out. And when it did, it would change everything. Moments later, Richard re-entered the room, trying to mask his surprise. He clutched a tablet in one hand, his fingers almost shaking. The smirk he'd carried earlier had faded, replaced by a mixture of confusion and something Darren recognized could only be fear. Behind him, Margaret Lyons, the bank manager, looked as though she had aged in the few minutes since she'd left to review his account details.
Mr. Ellison,
Margaret began, her voice controlled but noticeably strained.
we've confirmed everything with your account. I apologize for the misunderstanding.
The cold, formal apology did little to cool the frustration still swirling within Darren. But he held her gaze, his expression calm, waiting for her to continue. If she thought a quick apology was going to smooth over what he had just endured, she was mistaken. Margaret cleared her throat, her hands clasped in front of her.
I wasn't aware, initially, of who you are, of your position.
She struggled to find the right words, and the expression on her face was a mix of regret and embarrassment.
Your company, Tech Solutions, has been an important partner for our bank. I'm aware of your work with cybersecurity.
Darren's face remained impassive. He could see it now, the mental gymnastics she was performing, realizing the gravity of her workers' assumptions. But he wasn't going to give her an easy way out.
Ms. Lyons,
Darren said, his voice measured.
I don't think the issue here was my position, do you?
Richard's face flushed slightly, the reality of the situation dawning on him. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly understanding how badly he had miscalculated. Beside him, the security guard, Officer Tully, looked away, avoiding Darren's gaze altogether.
No.
Margaret admitted, looking down for a brief moment before meeting his gaze again.
It shouldn't have been an issue. I understand now that the assumptions made here were unfounded.
She hesitated, and Darren could see the struggle in her eyes as though realizing just how deeply those assumptions had been.
Darren leaned back, folding his arms, the slightest trace of a bitter smile on his lips.
Assumptions,
He echoed, his tone calm but sharp.
Funny how they have a way of surfacing in moments like these.
Richard looked as though he wanted to vanish, the weight of his earlier actions pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking.
Mr. Ellison, I'm sorry. We were only trying to do our job.
Your job?
Darren repeated, his voice low.
Do you honestly think this was just about your job?
His gaze bore into Richard's.
You saw what you wanted to see. You looked at me and decided who I was before I even spoke.
The room was thick with tension, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone present. Darren's words hung in the air, each one a challenge, a reminder of the bias they'd let guide their actions. Margaret's eyes looked around the room, her expression tightening as she took in the scene. She seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, the fact that a simple apology wasn't going to repair the damage done. This was more than a mere inconvenience. It was a painful, raw reflection of the biases that lay beneath the bank's pristine, polished exterior.
Mr. Ellison,
She said finally, her tone more formal.
I can assure you that we will be addressing this incident internally. This oversight doesn't reflect our values.
Darren felt a bitter laugh rise in his chest, but he held it back. The irony of her words was almost laughable. Oversight, values, words that sounded good on paper, but held little weight in reality.
No, Ms. Lyons,
He replied, his voice steady.
it does reflect your values. You all acted on assumptions about who I am, based on nothing more than a few pieces of paper and the way I look. That's not oversight. That's bias, plain and simple.
Margaret's face reddened, but she didn't deny it. Richard seemed to shrink into himself, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Darren's words.
The silence that followed was unbearable. Darren could feel everyone's eyes on him and sense the shift in their perceptions. He was no longer just another black man in their midst, a face they could ignore or judge without consequence. He was Darren Ellison, CEO of one of the most respected cybersecurity firms in the industry, and he wasn't about to let them forget it. The reality of the situation settled heavily on everyone in the room, its weight pressing down like a physical force. Darren could see the regret, the discomfort etched into each of their faces. But he knew that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had faced the same judgments, the same assumptions, without the privilege of a title to protect them. Margaret broke the silence, her voice quiet.
Mr. Ellison, again, we're deeply sorry for the misunderstanding. I hope you'll consider this an isolated incident.
An isolated incident.
Darren repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. He shook his head, his gaze unflinching.
It's never isolated. This happens every day to people who don't have the privilege of a title or a position to force others to see them differently.
The room fell silent again, the truth of his words sinking in. He knew they understood, even if they wouldn't admit it. They had made their assumptions and played their roles, and now they had to face the consequences. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but Darren held up a hand, stopping her.
Save your apologies. I'm not interested in them.
He rose from his seat, straightening his coat, his movements calm but deliberate.
If you really want to make a difference, then change your policies. Stop letting your assumptions guide your actions, because next time you might not be so lucky.
With that, he turned and walked toward the door, each step a reminder of his strength and resilience. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the bank on him. Darren had reclaimed his dignity and power, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him again. As Darren stepped back into the bank's main lobby, the customers were in groups, discussing what had happened earlier. Conversations stilled, and people who'd been too focused in their own lives moments earlier now couldn't tear their eyes away. His face, the look in his eyes, the strength in his stride, it all spoke volumes. He was no longer the suspect they'd assumed him to be, but a man of prominence and authority, someone who commanded respect and power. Darren felt their stares, but he held his head high, his expression unreadable. He didn't need their validation or their approval. This was not for them. This was for him, for every silent moment he'd endured, for every assumption that had gone unchecked. Margaret Lyons, the bank manager, followed close behind him. Her face was pale with an emotion that hovered somewhere between embarrassment and remorse. She cleared her throat, glancing nervously at the onlookers before addressing him, her voice shaking ever so slightly.
Mr. Ellison,
She said, trying to keep her tone steady.
once again, I want to offer our sincerest apologies for the way you were treated. This was unacceptable. I assure you, this isn't reflective of our values or standards.
Darren looked at her, his face impassive. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret that laced her words. But he knew this apology was as much for the audience as it was for him. She was trying to reclaim some semblance of authority, of professionalism, in a moment that had left her and her team exposed.
Miss Lyons,
He replied, his voice firm but controlled.
an apology doesn't erase what happened here. Your assumptions, your bias, those were real. And I can't just walk away as if this was a simple mistake. This was about more than policy. This was about perception, about judgment.
The audience shifted uncomfortably, a murmur rippling through the crowd. They felt the weight of his words, the truth they carried, a truth that no one could ignore. Richard, the teller who had first doubted him, stood to the side, visibly shrinking under Darren's gaze. His earlier confidence had crumbled, replaced by a look of remorse and embarrassment. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out in a low murmur.
Mr. Ellison, I'm sorry.
He said, his voice faltering.
I didn't mean... I was just doing my job.
Doing your job.
Darren repeated, his tone calm.
Tell me, Richard, if it had been anyone else, someone who didn't look like me, would you have done your job the same way?
Richard's face flushed, his eyes dropping to the floor. He didn't answer, and in his silence, the answer was clear. Darren let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment settling over them all. He could see the discomfort in their eyes, the realization of their own biases pressing down on them. And it wasn't just Richard or Margaret. It was everyone who had watched, everyone who had judged him without knowing a single thing about him.
You know,
Darren said finally, his voice filling the room.
I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't come here to make a statement or to challenge anyone. I came here as a customer, someone who simply wanted to complete a transaction and go about his day. And yet, here we are.
Margaret shifted, her expression pained. She looked as though she wanted to say something, to somehow make amends, but the words wouldn't come. Darren's gaze swept over the crowd, taking in the mixture of guilt, shame, and discomfort etched into their faces. Some avoided his eyes. Others looked at him with something like admiration, as if they were seeing him in a new light, a light that revealed a strength they hadn't anticipated. After a moment, Margaret took a deep breath, composing herself.
Mr. Ellison,
She said quietly.
please know that we're taking this incident very seriously. We will be implementing changes, training for our staff to ensure that something like this never happens again.
Darren inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words.
Good,
He said.
but remember, it's not about the training. It's about the way you see people, the way you judge them before you know them. You can't train that away.
Margaret nodded, her face flushed with the sting of his words.
Understood.
She replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As Darren turned to leave, a soft voice from the crowd called out, halting him in his tracks. He turned, surprised to see an elderly woman standing near the back, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and clear.
Thank you.
She said, her voice carrying across the room.
Thank you for speaking up. People need to hear this.
She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the other customers.
We all need to hear this.
Her words seemed to break the tension, and a few others in the crowd murmured their agreement, nodding and shifting uncomfortably. Darren felt a sense of relief, a faint flicker of hope. Perhaps, in some small way, this moment would mean something, not just for him, but for those who had witnessed it. Margaret, clearly shaken, cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure.
Mr. Ellison,
She said again, her tone softer.
If you would consider it, I'd like to arrange a meeting with our team to discuss any steps we can take to improve our policies and our approach. Your insight could make a real difference here.
Darren studied her for a moment, weighing her words. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret that had settled over her. Perhaps she was genuine in her offer. Maybe this incident would be a turning point for her and her team. Or perhaps, like so many others, it would be a temporary discomfort, quickly forgotten once he walked out the door. After a long pause, he gave a slow nod.
I'll consider it.
He said, his voice measured.
But remember, change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from facing the biases you hold, from challenging the way you see the world and the people around you.
With a final glance around the room, Darren turned and made his way toward the exit, the whispers of the crowd fading behind him. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the mixture of shame, respect, and perhaps even a hint of admiration. As he stepped outside, the cool autumn air hit him, fresh and bracing, a stark contrast to the stifling tension he'd left behind. He took a deep breath, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. He hadn't planned on being a voice for change today. He had only come to conduct his business, to go about his day. But life, he knew, had a way of forcing the unexpected. Standing on the bustling sidewalk, surrounded by the city's hum, Darren felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had reclaimed his dignity and his power, and he'd done it on his own terms. Perhaps, in some small way, he had planted a seed of change within that bank, within the minds of those who had witnessed it. He took one last look at the building behind him, its grand facade gleaming in the afternoon light. For them, this was just another day, another transaction. But for him, it was a reminder of the resilience he had built, the strength he carried, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. As he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to continue his work, not just in his field, but in the world. He was more than his title, more than the assumptions others made about him. He was Darren Ellison, a man who refused to be defined by anything but his truth. By the time Darren made it back to his office, news of the bank incident had already begun to spread. He hadn't told anyone, not even his team at Elitech, about the ordeal. But in today's world, news had a way of traveling faster than anyone could control. Someone in the bank must have recorded part of the scene. Perhaps they had captured his walk back through the lobby, Margaret Lyons's apology trailing behind him. The first call came just as he settled behind his desk. His assistant, Rachel Liu, poked her head in, her eyes wide with concern.
Darren,
She said, hesitating as if unsure whether to speak.
I think you should see this.
He raised an eyebrow, a sinking feeling forming in his stomach. He took her phone, noting the headline splashed across the screen. Black CEO falsely accused of fraud in NYC bank. Prejudice in plain sight. He let out a low breath, scanning the article, which recounted every detail of the incident with unsettling accuracy. They'd even included snippets of bystander accounts, quotes from patrons who'd been at the bank during the accusation. Some supported him, expressing regret at their own silence, while others dodged blame, claiming they'd had no idea who he was. But one comment stood out to him. A customer who, after learning about his role as a CEO, remarked, "I never would have guessed he was a big executive." Darren's eyes lingered on the words. They weren't meant as an insult, he knew, but they held a bitter truth. That, to some people, he didn't look the part. He was only halfway through the article when his phone buzzed. A familiar name flashed on the screen. Paul Kramer, a journalist for a respected financial magazine who'd interviewed him several years ago when Elitech first made headlines. The interview was about his company's groundbreaking work, but Darren remembered the skepticism in Paul's questions, the way the journalist had carefully probed his qualifications and subtly questioned his credentials. Darren hesitated, then answered.
Paul,
He said, his voice even.
didn't expect to hear from you today.
I imagine not,
Paul replied, his tone measured.
but I couldn't ignore what happened at the bank. I'm sorry you had to go through that. If you're willing, I'd like to cover this story. Tell it from your perspective.
Darren thought for a moment, the weight of the incident still fresh in his mind. He didn't need to tell his story for validation, nor did he seek sympathy. But he knew that if this article reached the right audience, it could open people's eyes to something bigger than just his experience.
All right, Paul,
Darren said, his voice firm.
but understand this. I'm not interested in making this about me. This needs to be about what these incidents mean for people everywhere, in all kinds of places. It's not just my story.
Paul paused, and Darren could hear the subtle shift in his tone when he spoke again.
I understand, Darren. I'll make sure your message is heard.
The next day, the article went live, quickly gaining traction. Paul's piece was raw and unfiltered, detailing Darren's experience at the bank, but weaving it into a larger discussion on bias and systemic injustice. He quoted Darren's words verbatim. Change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from facing the biases you hold, from challenging the way you see the world and the people around you. By evening, news outlets had picked up the story, and Darren's phone buzzed with interview requests from local networks, talk shows, and even a national morning show. But amidst the flood of media interest, there was one call he hadn't expected. Margaret Lyons herself.
Mr. Ellison,
She began, her voice strained but sincere.
I saw the article. I understand if you want nothing to do with our institution after this, but I wanted to personally extend an invitation. Our board has discussed the incident, and we'd like to work with you on creating a training program for our staff. We don't want this to happen again, to anyone.
Darren was silent for a moment, considering her words. He didn't need the validation or the apology, and part of him wanted nothing more than to walk away, to leave her and her bank to grapple with the fallout. But he thought of his mother, of the countless individuals who might face what he had if he turned his back.
Ms. Lyons,
He said finally, his tone calm but firm.
if you're serious about creating real change, then I'm willing to help. But know that I won't be a token. This can't just be about your reputation.
Margaret's voice softened, and Darren could sense a note of genuine remorse.
Understood, Mr. Ellison. I appreciate your candor. We're committed to learning from this.
Over the next few weeks, Darren found himself thrust into a new role, balancing his responsibilities at Elitech with his unexpected position as an advocate for systemic change. Margaret invited him to address her team, and he spoke candidly, outlining what needed to change, beginning with the assumptions that had guided their actions in the first place. The media coverage continued to expand, his story becoming a focal point in broader conversations about racial bias and corporate responsibility. On social media, hashtags emerged, with users across the country sharing their own experiences under the label #seen but not known. Some recounted instances in which they'd been judged unfairly in stores or banks, while others expressed regret, admitting that they had been quick to judge people like Darren. The story became a rallying cry, a call for businesses to re-examine their practices and for individuals to confront their own biases. Darren watched the dialogue unfold, a mix of hope and sorrow filling him as he read each account, each painful memory laid bare for the world to see. Then, one afternoon, he received a message that struck him deeply. It was from a young college student named Isaiah Green, studying computer science and struggling with the same challenges Darren had faced in his early days. Isaiah wrote that he'd read Darren's story and felt a surge of hope, a renewed determination to push forward, no matter what he encountered.
Knowing that someone like you made it,
Isaiah wrote,
makes me believe that maybe Ali can too.
Darren felt the words settle in his chest, his heart heavy but proud. This was why he'd endured, spoken up, and refused to let the incident be swept under the rug. Isaiah's message was a reminder that his fight wasn't just for himself. It was for every young person coming after him, every individual who needed to know that they were worth more than the assumptions others made. As the weeks went on, Darren continued to work with the bank, helping to develop a training program that challenged not only their staff's knowledge, but also their perspectives. He consulted with diversity and inclusion specialists, psychologists, and community leaders to create something that wasn't just a box to check, but a meaningful experience that would stay with the employees long after the sessions ended. Slowly, he began to see change, not just in the bank, but in the world around him. People who had once looked past him now sought him out, eager to learn, understand, and do better. The work was exhausting, the journey far from over, but Darren felt a renewed sense of purpose guiding him. He was more than a CEO, more than a symbol. He was Darren Ellison, a man who had taken his struggle and transformed it into something greater, something that might make the world a little better for those who came after him. Wonderful. In Section 7, Darren's mission for change, Darren takes his experience and uses it to fuel a larger mission aimed at addressing racial bias in professional settings. We'll focus on his vision to create long-lasting change, including mentoring young people like Isaiah and forming a foundation to combat discrimination. He found himself at the center of discussions on racial bias and systemic inequality, his inbox filled with messages from people sharing their own experiences and thanking him for speaking up. With each story he read and conversation he had, Darren felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. The work was exhausting, yes, but it was also empowering. He had turned a painful moment into something meaningful, something that had the potential to change lives. It was during one late-night brainstorming session with Rachel, his assistant, that the idea for a foundation took shape. They discussed the impact the incident had made, the waves it had sent through social media, and the emails from young people like Isaiah, who looked to him as a source of inspiration.
You know,
Rachel said, tapping her pen against her notebook thoughtfully.
you could do more with this. People are listening, Darren. They're ready to learn. Imagine what we could do if we had an organization dedicated to creating change, to guiding companies, schools, anyone willing to take a hard look at their biases.
Darren considered her words, his mind racing.
A foundation.
He murmured, the concept taking shape as he spoke.
Something that could address these issues on a larger scale. Not just a one-time training, but real, lasting change.
Rachel's eyes brightened.
Exactly. We could offer workshops, mentorship programs, resources for individuals facing discrimination. Think of it as Elitech's contribution to social equity, a foundation dedicated to addressing bias in the workplace and beyond.
Darren felt a rush of excitement mingled with a sense of purpose. He knew what this would mean, the hours, the dedication, but he also knew that it was worth it. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder that he had a responsibility to lift others as he climbed. The next day, he began laying the groundwork for the foundation, enlisting the help of a team who shared his vision. He named it the Ellison Initiative for Equity, a nod to both his family and his mission. Within weeks, the foundation had a clear purpose: to combat bias, to support young people of color entering professional spaces, and to create educational resources for companies willing to address systemic inequalities. The work was immediate. As word of the Ellison Initiative spread, organizations from across the country reached out, eager to participate in his training sessions. They wanted to know how they could dismantle their own biases and build environments where people were seen for their talents rather than stereotypes. Darren personally led the first training session, held in the same bank where the incident had occurred. Margaret Lyons, the bank manager, stood by as he addressed her team, his presence a reminder of both the mistake they'd made and the commitment they now held to do better. He spoke openly, sharing not only his own experience, but the broader implications of such biases, how they erode trust, and how they hold people back.
This isn't about blame,
Darren said, his voice steady.
It's about awareness. Every one of us has biases. The goal here is to recognize them, to challenge them, and to create a space where they no longer control our actions.
As he spoke, he watched the faces of the bank employees, some tense, others thoughtful. But by the end of the session, he sensed a shift. The room seemed lighter, as though the act of acknowledging these uncomfortable truths had released a collective burden. After the training, Margaret approached him, gratitude evident in her expression.
Thank you, Darren.
She said, her voice thick with emotion.
This has changed us, truly.
Darren nodded, knowing that her words, though sincere, were only the beginning. Real change, he knew, would require more than a single training session. It would require ongoing commitment and the willingness to question assumptions and confront uncomfortable truths. As the Ellison Initiative continued to grow, Darren's work expanded beyond corporate training. He developed a mentorship program aimed at supporting young Black and brown professionals, providing them with resources, guidance, and connections to help them navigate industries that weren't always welcoming. Isaiah Green, the college student who had written him shortly after the incident, became one of his first mentees. Darren met with him regularly, offering advice, sharing stories from his journey, and helping him build a network that would support his ambitions. One afternoon, Isaiah sat across from Darren in his office, his face a mixture of excitement and nerves.
I wanted to thank you.
Isaiah began, his voice earnest.
I never thought I'd have a mentor like you, someone who gets it, who's been through what I'm going through.
Darren leaned forward, his gaze steady.
Isaiah, you're going to do incredible things. Don't ever doubt that. You belong in this industry just as much as anyone else. And when you face those moments of doubt, those times when you feel like you don't belong, remember that you're not alone.
Isaiah nodded, his expression resolute. Darren saw something of himself in the young man, the same hunger, the same resilience, and he felt a surge of pride, knowing that he could help guide the next generation forward. The Ellison Initiative became a movement, and its influence spread as more individuals and organizations joined the cause. Darren spoke at conferences, led workshops at universities, and hosted community events aimed at fostering understanding and empathy. His story, once a single painful incident, had become a beacon of hope and a rallying point for people everywhere who had been marginalized, underestimated, or ignored. As he continued this work, Darren felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He was no longer just the CEO of Elitech Solutions. He was a mentor, a leader, and an advocate for change. He'd turned his struggle into strength, his pain into purpose, and with each step forward, he honored the legacy his mother had instilled in him, a legacy of resilience, dignity, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be seen, heard, and valued.